Boa tarde, muito bem-vindos à sala Zoom do TBA para a primeira de duas lições, uma hoje e outra amanhã à mesma hora, sobre logística entendida de um modo crítico, enquanto fundamental para compreender os processos contemporâneos de organização do trabalho, produção, distribuição e consumo. Processos estes que a corrente pandemia, com a necessidade de paragem que a interrupção da circulação do vírus acarreta, veio de algum modo, em maior ou menor grau, curto-circuitar, tornando porventura mais evidentes. A ideia destas duas lições apareceu em maio, quando logo após o primeiro confinamento de março-abril, em que apenas os trabalhadores ditos essenciais estavam autorizados a circular, houve um grande surto de Covid na plataforma logística da Azambuja. E de repente, um local de bastidores, ponto nodal da área metropolitana de Lisboa, mas também da distribuição da zona centro-sul do país, foi durante um breve período iluminado pelas notícias que davam a ver armazéns, contentores, paletes, linhas de armazenamento, carrinhos de distribuição, mas sobretudo trabalhadores migrantes. Aliás, há uma imagem a esse respeito claríssima, em que se vêem trabalhadores negros, marroquinos e indianos a passar a linha do comboio. Uma série de corpos que muitas vezes não temos como presentes enquanto portugueses, até para dizer assim abruptamente. De repente, a pandemia mostra como essenciais uma série de trabalhadores que possivelmente nem sequer a nacionalidade tinham. E isto a trabalharem num local que normalmente também não é falado, que era a plataforma logística da Azambuja. A imbricação entre a deslocação das coisas e a situação das panelas dos vírus e certas lógicas de produção de um espaço heterogéneo são evidentes. Terrenos no qual o trabalho de Sandro Mesadra é ímpar, pelo que me pareceu um excelente pretexto para este convite que eu vinha há algum tempo a pensar em fazer. Trata-se não de uma conferência, mas de duas lições, em inglês, especificamente sobre logística crítica, tema pouco abordado em Portugal e que me parece merecedor de destaque. Estas lições vão ser gravadas, ficando disponíveis depois online, estou já a avisar toda a gente. Há um texto de apoio com indicações bibliográficas e sugestões de autores que nós traduzimos e que nos foi dado, é um texto do Sandro Mesada e Brett Nielsen, está na página do TBA, e sobretudo gostávamos que houvesse espaço para conversa, debate e questões no final. Estas questões, um pouco para simplificar o caos que normalmente são os zooms coletivos, estamos hoje a tentar usar o formato webinar, então as questões podem-se colocar de duas maneiras, ou por chat escrevendo, ou então usando a opção raise hand, levantar a mão, e falando. Pronto, aí desativa-se o sistema mute e interpela-se diretamente o Sandro. O link Zoom para a sessão da manhã vai ser divulgado hoje ainda. Para além disto, eu convidei dois investigadores, Franco Tomassoni e Andrea Pavoni, que estão a organizar um primeiro livro sobre logística crítica editado no país, com o prefácio de Sandro Mesadra em edição da cooperativa Outro Modo, do Le Monde Diplomatique, para estarem connosco em diálogo no final, numa sessão que, repito, eu gostava que fosse aberta. Esta primeira sessão de hoje vai introduzir algumas noções básicas, autores relevantes, história e atuais desenvolvimentos críticos deste campo. E a segunda sessão, amanhã, passa pela apresentação de exemplos de lutas sociais e laborais atualmente em curso, terminando com uma discussão sobre o capitalismo de plataforma na sua relação com a logística. Passo finalmente a apresentar o Sandro Mesadra, que já esteve várias vezes em Portugal e que vários de nós conhecemos e que felizmente alguns dos seus livros estão editados. Era bom que houvesse mais. Então, Sandro Mesadra é professor na Universidade de Bolonha. Os seus estudos concentram-se na história das ideias políticas e na teoria política. Nos últimos anos tem trabalhado sobre as relações entre globalização, migração e cidadania, teoria pós-colonial, capitalismo contemporâneo, operaísmo e autonomismo italiano. Saiu hoje no Público Online um artigo que no Y, sexta-feira, uma entrevista feita por António Guerreiro a Sandro Mesadra, que sairá no Y sexta-feira. Muito obrigada, Sandro. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm really happy to be with you tonight, although, of course, it would be much better to physically be in Lisbon. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do so in the next future. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about logistics in a theater, and I take the invitation as a sign, a symptom of a growing interest in logistics also in Portugal. In general, interest in logistics is spurred, first of all, by the awareness of the prominent roles that logistics play in the working of contemporary capitalism and in our life. But the growing interest in logistics is also nurtured by the development of powerful social and labor struggles related to infrastructures as well as to labor conditions in ports, logistical warehouses, transport, and food delivery. Logistics has long been considered as a neutral, merely technical domain, a topic for engineers and the science of management. But today, logistics is at the center of a lively field of critical studies, which involve geographers and architects, anthropologists and political theorists, designers and urban scholars. This booming of interest and studies of logistics is doomed to grow even more in the next future. If one considers the development of logistics through the lens of the pandemic, of the current global pandemic crisis. It is interesting to note that from the point of view of logistics, the pandemic at first was a shock. It was a shock because of the slowdown and in many cases the still stand of the logistical machine. But quite soon, in the following months, we have witnessed a kind of a dramatic reorganization of logistics. And logistics has been widely considered an essential economic activity during the pandemic. This also means that logistical workers were acknowledged as as essential workers with what this definition implies. Needless to say, logistics is a very wide field. It includes transport, infrastructures, digital platforms. Today, I will provide a kind of general introduction to logistics, while tomorrow I will focus more on digital platforms and platform capitalism. But allow me to start by saying something about my own work on logistics, which is not a merely individual work. It is rather rooted in a number of collective research projects. My long-standing collaboration with Brett Nilsson is particularly important from this point of view. In 2019, we published a book, The Politics of Operations, Excavating Contemporary Capitalism, where logistics figures prominently. But then I would like to mention at least two research projects that were very important in steering my interest in logistics. The first project was a project on the Chinese New Silk Road, bearing the title Logistical Wars. The Chinese New Silk Road, and let me anticipate that speaking of logistics also means speaking of the turbulence, the tensions, the conflicts that surround the world order and disorder. And the second research project I would like to mention is a European research project on platforms, labor, and urban spaces that I am currently coordinating with 16 partners, including a Portuguese one. I also want to mention a project launched by younger collaborators of mine, Into the Black Box, which is a really challenging attempt to map logistical developments from the angle of social and labor struggles. Check the website of Into the Black Box. It is worth doing that. But let's start from the basics. And let's ask a very simple question. What is logistics? What do we mean speaking of logistics? At first, logistics is a mundane and even banal activity. According to the definition provided by one of the pioneers of industrial logistics in Germany, Reinhard Hünemann, I quote, "The logistical task consists in providing the right amount of the right objects at the right place in the right quality to the right time at the right cost." The word right is continuously repeated in this definition. Apparently neutral and technical considerations such as operational efficiency and pragmatic standards of performance seem to prevail in the domain of logistics. As I was saying before, however, in recent years, critical thinkers have developed the concept of logistics to analytically describe a mode of power specific to the practices of organization, management, adaptation that have enabled the stretching and coordination of production and trade across diverse scales and spaces. So logistics as power, a specific form of power. The word logistics is not new, but it began to be widely used in the 1960s and in the 1970s. In those years, several technical and scientific innovations led to the emergence of a new mobility paradigm, of a new way to organize, steer the mobility of staff and people. Within the emerging field of critical logistics studies, this new mobility paradigm is widely considered as a crucial driver of contemporary global capitalism, often defined as logistical capitalism. There is an iconic representation of the new logistical mobility paradigm that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. And it is the shipping container. This apparently simple cube that disrupted and radically transformed not only the circulation of commodities across the oceans, but also the organization of labor in docks and ports. The shipping container is thus an iconic representation of the new logistical mobility paradigm. It is also important at this point to introduce a notion that is closely linked with the shipping container, and this notion is supply chain. The supply chain, which means the management and organization of the supply of components that are used in industrial production is a notion that is often connected with logistics. I was speaking before of a logistical capitalism. Several scholars speak at the same time of a supply chain capitalism. Just think of the early 1970s, the economic crisis that led to the end of Fordism in the West, the oil crisis in 1973. One of the main responses of capital to that crisis was the massive outsourcing of industrial activities. And that massive outsourcing of industrial activities, mainly to the so-called Global South, would not have been possible without the new logistical mobility paradigm, iconically represented by the shipping container. Let me say a couple of words about the history of logistics. It is important to keep in mind that logistics in the modern age has important military origins. What military historians called the military revolution that started in the second half of the 16th century was a crucial moment in the history of logistics. The main problem was to liberate armies from the tyranny of plunder, which means to organize lines of supply and information up to the needs of modern armies. Another important moment in the history of logistics were the Napoleonic Wars. And a Swiss military scholar, Antoine-Henri Jomini, wrote in 1838 a treaty dedicated to the art of war, where you can find a first systematization of logistics. So I repeat, it is important to keep in mind this military genealogy of modern logistics. And this is because the military origins of logistics continue to haunt its development. And there is a need to stress that also the shipping container emerged in the US out of the military effort of the war in Vietnam. This kind of link between logistics and the military is often emphasized in critical studies of logistics. I repeat that I consider it important, but it is also important to look for different origins of modern logistics. And I will mention just two of them that are particularly important. Two US American scholars, Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, have emphasized the relevance of the Middle Passage, which means of the Atlantic slave trade, for the emergence of modern logistics. And of course, in the Middle Passage, the main problem was to coordinate the effort to store and silence a very peculiar commodity, a speaking commodity, which means the slave, the African slave. It's again a kind of dark origin of logistics, but quite different from the military one. What matters here are commodities of a specific type. A second origin of logistics can be located in the colonial operations of chartered companies like the British East India Company. Again, the relation here is between the origin of logistics and modern European colonialism. the military plays an important role in the operations of a chartered company like the British East India Company, but trade is also very important. As you will understand, the way in which we reconstruct the genealogy of logistics is important not only historically, but also for a critical understanding of the present. And from this point of view, there is a need to emphasize the kind of heterogeneity of the genealogy of logistics, a genealogy that includes military moments, colonial moments, slave trade, trade in general, the circulation of commodities. The line between economic and military activity remains thin in logistical operations today and in the working of infrastructures connected to those operations. But nevertheless, the so-called logistics revolution is an important threshold. Logistics revolution is a phrase that circulates in management studies. And in a way, it is a celebration of the dramatic transformations in the field of logistics that I was mentioning before with respect to the 1960s and 1970s. And over the last decades, the economic rationality of logistics has come more and more to the fore. And the emergence of logistics as a business proposition and civilian practice dates to the post-World War II period, particularly in the United States. The logistics revolution culminates in the 1960s when the introduction of a system analysis approach to transport and distribution dynamics began to reshape the world of production. One of the pioneers of the so-called logistics revolution, Peter Drucker, emphasized the need to consider what he called the whole process of business. It may sound very general, but what Drucker had in mind was the need to go beyond the strict distinction between production, distribution, circulation in the economic activities of a firm. So he was looking for new devices, new logistical devices capable to reorganize the whole process of business, to reorganize at the same time production, distribution, circulation, going beyond the narrow understanding of those domains. and changes that occurred in this period and its aftermath include the spatial reorganization of the firm, the interlinking of logistics science with computing and software design, the introduction of the shipping container, the formation of business organizations and academic programs for the production and dissemination of logistical knowledge, the development of real-time technologies for monitoring labor, the emergence of global supply chains, and the search for cheap labor rates in poorer areas of the world. Quite a long list. In the discussion, we can go into the details. But what I would like to stress now is that already in the 1960s, there were attempts to develop, for instance, real-time technologies for monitoring labor that today we experience in their effectiveness and sophistication. And the development of real-time technologies for monitoring labor was part and parcel of the development of logistics, of the so-called logistics revolution. It is important to focus on this phrase used by Peter Drucker, the whole process of business. And this is because one of the main implications of the development of logistics in the last decades was precisely a kind of reshuffling of the relations between production, distribution, and circulation. The logistics revolution produced dramatic changes in the calculation and organization of economic spaces. I was already speaking about global supply chains. Global supply chains were and are at the same time an outcome of the logistics revolution and a device that further prompts the logistics revolution. Global supply chains produce new spaces, new economic spaces, but we will see that this logistical production of space, that is a capitalist production of space, also has legal and political implications. The logistics revolution materially enabled both what with the means of action beyond the walls of the factory and the extensive stretching of supply chains across the globe. it is important, I think, and I propose to you to look at logistics from this double angle, which means focusing on the one hand on the extensive reorganization of economic spaces at the global level, and on the way in which logistics enables a reorganization and socialization of production beyond the walls of the factory in the wake of the crisis of Fordism. If you think of these two sides of the operations of logistics, you can easily understand that logistics is a force, a power that enables some of the most important features of contemporary capitalism, both regarding its global scope and regarding the socialization of production, the subsumption of the factory itself within a wider fabric of social production. What we call today logistics, logistics as a business proposition and civilian practice, was usually called before the so-called logistics revolution, physical distribution. Physical distribution was the notion employed by management scientists, for instance, in handbooks dedicated to the organization of the different economic activities within a single firm. There was production, and then there was physical distribution. And which was the problem of physical distribution? I think this is a very important question. The problem of physical distribution was minimizing costs after production. Minimizing costs after production. Such a phrase is predicated upon a firm boundary distinguishing production and distribution. First, you have production, which is the real matter, where value is added, and then you have distribution, physical distribution. Since it was not considered possible to add value in physical distribution, the main problem for managers and organizers was to minimize costs which also means to minimize the time needed for distribution. Coming to logistics, the problem that was formulated in the 1960s and that continues to be at the center of logistical developments and operations is completely different. Logistics is interested in value added across circulatory systems. This is the radical implication of the phrase by Peter Drucker, the whole process of business. Circulation can be a sphere where value is added. You see how the distinction between production and circulation is blurred. It is blurred because value can be added not only in production, but also in circulation. And this is a kind of revolution indeed from the point of view of capital. So I repeat, because I think this is a very important point, maybe the most interesting and relevant point from a theoretical angle. The new mobility paradigm brought about by the so-called logistics revolution works the boundary between production and circulation. At the same time, as I was saying before, the myth that production stopped at the factory gates, already challenged by feminist theory and politics, as well as in the celebrated autonomist thesis of the social factory, was shattered with the evolution of more sophisticated management systems that made the practice of trading labor and transport costs off against each other a more exact science. The operations of inventory giants like Amazon and Walmart, which are iconic kind of representations of the logistical rationality, would be literally inconceivable without the new mobility paradigm brought about by the logistics revolution. And the same, I repeat, can be said for globalization in general. Logistics provides the infrastructural skeleton of capitalist globalization. So I would like to close this first class and to open the discussion, speaking a bit more of Amazon and Walmart from the point of view of what I was describing before as the blurring of the boundary between production and circulation. And indeed, I just mentioned Amazon and Walmart, while speaking of the new relations between production and circulation engendered by the development of logistics. But these new relations between production and circulation have dramatic implications, both for capital and for labor. Just think of an iconic corporation at the height of industrial capitalism. Say General Motors. What is good for General Motors is good for America, was the slogan. We had a similar slogan in Italy. What is good for Fiat is good for Italy. Luckily, those slogans were challenged and disrupted by workers' struggles. Anyway, if we think of General Motors, it is pretty clear that distribution, physical distribution, its space, its geographical scope, its role in the circulation of capital was completely subordinated to production. It was the pace of production that commanded over the pace of distribution. Distribution was, in a way, a secondary kind of dynamic. But if we take inventory giants like Walmart and Amazon as iconic corporations of present-day capitalism, we are confronted with a completely different situation. The operations of those corporations, first of all, would be unthinkable by the logistical global stretching and reshaping of supply chains. And this means that logistics is a crucial condition of possibility of the very existence of Amazon and Walmart. But maybe more interestingly, to put it shortly, nowadays, supply chain operations often tend to exercise command over processes of production. It's a dramatic reversal of the kind of traditional situation we are accustomed to link with capitalism, with industrial capitalism in particular. In many cases, and definitely in the operations of Amazon, production is subordinated to supply chain operations, to distribution, which also means to circulation. Examining the supply chain operations of Amazon and Walmart, anthropologist Anna Tsing shows, for instance, how they push costs back to producers. who are allowed to use any methods they want to keep prices at a minimum. And usually, as we know, these methods involve eliminating labor and environmental standards. Let me be clear. I'm not celebrating the vanishing of production. I'm not talking about the marginalization of the moment of production. Production must be performed. Otherwise, the commodities that Amazon delivers to our place would not exist. So I repeat, production must be performed, and this is crucially important. But how production is performed is, however, at the end of the day, indifferent. What is even more crucial for the practices of valorization pursued by companies like Walmart and Amazon is precisely the logistical capacity to synchronize diverse modes of production along the supply chain. Speaking of this synchronization of diverse labor regimes and modes of production along the supply chain, Anna Tsing, the anthropologist that I was mentioning before, uses the term piracy. I think the term piracy nicely describes the relation between logistical supply chain operations and their surrounding economic and social environments as an extractive relation. This is, for me, a very important point. We will come back to it tomorrow, speaking of platform capitalism. But let me say that I am convinced that an extractive moment characterizes the working of logistics today, as well as other capitalist operations, for instance, in the realm of finance, that play a crucial role in the working of contemporary capitalism. So extraction is an important notion that opens up a productive critical angle on logistical operations. So maybe this is, for me, the most important point in today's class. There would be much more to say about logistics, and tomorrow I will add something also regarding the question of logistics in general before going into details in the analysis of platform capitalism. But for now, I would like to discuss with you this kind of reversal of the relation between distribution, circulation, and production with respect to industrial capitalism. Let me add to conclude that this kind of reversal is an important circumstance. Also, if we look at recent developments in agriculture, also agriculture has been dramatically transformed by logistical operations, by the emergence and entrenchment of the logistical rationality that I quickly described tonight. In agriculture, we have witnessed over the last couple of decades what several scholars and activists call retailing revolution. What does a retailing revolution mean? It means that inventory giants like Carrefour, for instance, just to mention one of them, are more and more able to dictate the conditions and the pace of agricultural production. Production chains, including canneries, have therefore become retailer-driven. And the effects of this shift, this logistical shift, impinge on the condition of often migrant workers and lead to specific processes of zoning in many parts of the world, including Italy and Portugal. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to reply to questions and to listen to your feedbacks and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandros. Thank you so much. And thank you. Obrigada a todos por terem vindo. Eu peço desculpa, há bocado no início eu não vos estava a ver, por isso é que eu não dei logo as boas-vindas. Ou seja, este é o primeiro webinar do TBA, ainda estou aqui a perceber como é que isto funciona. Então, agora podemos abrir para questões. Pedíamos que as escrevessem ou que ponham a mão no ar, utilizando o raise hands, e damos-vos a palavra. Entretanto, I might have already one or two questions, but actually it's not so much questions as maybe some points I would like you to talk a bit more further. So one has to do with the production of space, this idea of how logistics seems to, how logistical revolution nowadays with internet and digital presupposes a homogeneous space where everything flows. I order something and in 2 days it's here, because as if the space is homogeneous, which is not. So I would like to put this emphasis on the production of space and how logistics has to do with this production of space. A space, and I think this is very interesting, that is pretty much produced by borders, and how borders that you have researched for so long are part and parcel of this production of space, and not so borders seen not so much as a wall that forbids something to come across, but as something which is production that says who can come in and can get out, etc. So this production of space at very different levels, political levels, geographical levels, urban levels. So, which I think it has to do with what you were saying in the end, this notion of piracy. So the relation of the logistical supply chains with its surrounding environments. So I think it's this, which then led you to this extractive moment. So question 2 would have to do with the notion of extraction and extractivism. So I would ask you to develop a little bit further that notion. And finally, I was very interested in this notion of synchronization. So this matter of pace and rhythm, which is very important when we approach production and circulation nowadays, when we have a technology working 24/7. So I think so are these 3 points. I don't know, Andrea and Franco, if you have questions, or someone else.
Yes, may ask 2 really open questions to Sandro. Thanks a lot for your encompassing relation. I have 2 open questions. One is related with labor, and the other one is related with geopolitics. Well, the first one is how logistic, and in general your proposal about the unity between logistic, finance, and extraction, which is a proposal advanced in your last book with Brett Nelson, Operation of the Politics of Operation, address the debate on material and immaterial labor, and which is actually really an open question. And the second one is to which extent the logistics and yes, and again your perspective about the unity on logistic, finance, and extraction help us to understand this geopolitical competition that we are actually attended between China and United States. I mean, from the logistic point of view, how we can understand that competition. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe Sandro wants to answer, because otherwise we're gonna pile up so many questions. So maybe I would say just answer this first round, and then I will say something if there is time.
Okay, thank you very much. They are all challenging and brilliant comments and questions. It would take some time to answer them in full, and maybe I would not be able to do that. But let me start with the question of space, production of space. Actually, it was the first topic I had in my notes for tomorrow, but I'm very happy to anticipate something. Anna was mentioning the question of borders, and I've been working on borders and migration for many, many years now. And the question of borders was important for me, for Brett and me, also to frame our work on logistics. I mentioned several times critical studies of logistics. Without giving names and titles, I will now mention an important book that was published in 2014 by Deborah Cowan. And the title of the book is The Deadly Life of Logistics. Cowan makes a very interesting distinction between geopolitical borders and what she calls the logistical seam. She adds that the rigidity of geopolitical borders is often a problem for logistics. The securitization and militarization of borders that we currently witness in many parts of the world is a problem for logistics. So we have tried to look at logistical spaces from the point of view of this distinction between border and seam. And what we have seen is that in the production and governance of logistical spaces, usually you are confronted with a kind of hybrid formation where you find both the logic of the border and the logic of the seam. In order to make this point less abstract, let's mention a couple of typical logistical spaces. A logistical space can be a zone, usually a spatial zone. A logistical space can be a corridor, huge corridors that connect countries and continents. A logistical space can be a hub. A logistical space can even be a warehouse or a port. And I was saying at the very beginning of my class that during the pandemic, and in particular during lockdowns, logistical workers were considered essential workers, quote and unquote. If you look at the way in which essential logistical workers, who often happen to be migrants, have worked during lockdowns, well, they have worked under conditions of segregation. The logistical spaces in which they have been working, such as logistical warehouses, for instance, have been bordered under the exceptional conditions of the pandemic. And I think that this gives an idea of the fact that far from being smooth, logistical spaces are highly striated spaces. Although it is true that the way in which boundaries and demarcations work in logistical spaces is quite different from the way in which traditional geopolitical borders work. An important point to be added is that logistical spaces cover up the whole planet today. If you try to visualize in a map logistical spaces today, you will end up having a map that is quite different from the one we are accustomed to see from the traditional geopolitical map, in which you have borders circumscribing and distinguishing discrete national territories. Okay, And this is a point that leads me to the second question asked by Franco. In very general terms, I am convinced that this distinction and tension between logistical spaces as spaces of capital and traditional geopolitical spaces provides us with an effective angle precisely on the geopolitical competition that we are currently witnessing, even between China and the US. Think of China. China today promotes globalization. I don't know if you heard the talk of Xi Jinping in Davos a couple of days ago. I mean, it was a celebration of globalization. And what does globalization mean for China? It means, first of all, the so-called New Silk Road, which means a giant, a very ambitious logistical project. This does not mean that traditional geopolitical logics are not playing any more a role today. They play a role, but I insist on the disconnection, on the gap, on the potential conflict between logistical spaces and political spaces. The second question asked by Anna refers to the question of extraction. And again, tomorrow I will come back to this question speaking of platforms. But let me say in general that I am convinced that today extraction is a notion that allows us to grasp some of the most important operations of capital we are confronted with. Franco was mentioning our book, The Politics of Operation, where we emphasize the links between extraction in literal sense, results extraction, logistics, and finance. We look at extraction, logistics, and finance precisely to discern a kind of operative logics that is more and more important in the general organization of capitalism today. And we do not contend that industrial production, for instance, doesn't play any role today. The opposite is the case. In many parts of the world, we are witnessing a kind of booming of industrial activities. And we have to come to grips with that booming. The point for us is that industrial capital is not anymore able to shape, organize, synchronize the whole of capitalism. the commanding logic in the articulation of contemporary capitalism is not anymore an industrial logic. We think that the notion of extraction, particularly if we use that notion in order to critically analyze such domains as logistics and finance, can provide us with a key to understanding the general working of contemporary capitalism. And this has, of course, also a lot to do with the first question asked by Franco, which means the question regarding material, immaterial labor. I must say that I never used the notion of immaterial labor for many reasons. I can explain them, of course. But what matters for us is not at all the vanishing of material labor. I wanted to repeat that. We are rather interested in understanding the way in which even the most material labor is shaped, organized, commanded by a logic that is not the logic corresponding to material production. It is much more the logic corresponding to logistics, to finance. For us, it is important to look at the transformations of the composition of labor that correspond to such a situation. And our point, I put it very quickly, then we can discuss, is that today, precisely because of the development I quickly outlined, we are confronted with an intensified heterogeneity of living labor. And I will have something more to say about that tomorrow, speaking of digital labor and platform labor. The third question asked by Anna, the question regarding synchronization. I already mentioned the word synchronization in my reply. I would say that logistics is a science of synchronization from a temporal point of view, as well as it is a science for the management and the production and the management of space. The question of synchronization is very important in order to understand the temporality not only of labor but also of life that corresponds to the dominance of the logistical rationality. But synchronization is a word that also refers to very specific and crucially important technical problems. For instance, the problem of interoperability, which means the connection between different systems, different logistical systems, you know. A classical example of interoperability is the relation between a port and a railroad. You know, two different transport systems that must be connected and synchronized. But nowadays we are more and more confronted with problems of synchronization between different softwares, different digital worlds. This is a problem for the operations of platforms, but it is also a problem if you think of such an ambitious project as the new Silk Road, which connects countries, spaces, territories, where usually digital systems are quite different. So let's say that the rhetoric of logistics refers to a smooth space and to a full synchronization of times. But in both cases, this utopia can never be accomplished. And what is interesting in logistics is precisely the continuous reproduction and multiplication of tensions, of frictions, both spatially and temporally.
Oh, Sandro, thank you so much. We do have a question here from Felipe Santos. Maybe we can put the video on, Felipe. Someone? And so Felipe asked, can we today survive without a global supply chain or without totally depending from the South Asian countries? It's written here in the Q&A. He says, these countries in a matter of years will be able to monopolize all the cost of our way of living. So what can we do to keep global and at least interdependent? Thank you, wonderful conversation. Felipe, if you look at here on the Q&A.
Okay, but I see also another question by Luis Antonio.
Oh, here, yes, we have another question. Hello, I'm Walter Alves, and I'd love to ask you, Mr. Mesadra, if the work of Maurizio Lazzarato has been useful to your work. If so, in what way does Lazzarato's cognitive capitalism, cognitive cultural, operates in your analysis of thought, particularly in your concept of logistic space? May I add, for the sake of proper problematization, the word space should mean more than a portion of physical territory. Thank you very much, Mr. Mesadra. Shall we do two and then we have another one from Luis Antonio?
Yes, just give me a second.
Yes, so we'll try to do flip sentence and VRA, and then, sorry, Luis, but it's not easy to read, and I'm better to answer back. Okay.
Okay, Felipe asks a very important question for all of us, also beyond my talk tonight. Let me reply in a quick way. I don't think we can survive without global supply chains. The dependence from the South Asian countries is a related but different question. I think that one of the main problems we are confronted with today is precisely to organize interdependence and to find ways to turn the kind of conflictive multipolarism we are seeing today into a multipolarism that allows degrees of cooperation, working toward a world where there is more freedom and more equality. I think that a lot of things will depend also on what will happen in the South Asian countries and in China in the next years. I think we have to bet on the emergence of social movements, labor and social struggles within those countries that would lay the basis for a different kind of more cooperative interdependence at the global level. But anyway, just to reply to your first question, I don't think we can survive without global supply chains. Although I have to add that we are living through such a deep crisis nowadays due to the pandemic that we will have to see which will be the conditions in the wake of this crisis. I think that also the form, at least, of global supply chains, or let's put it simply, of globalization, is at stake in the current crisis. So the second question is about Maurizio Lazzarato, who is a good friend of mine. And let me say that in the last years, Maurizio has taken a critical distance from the very notion of cognitive capitalism. Nowadays, is a radical critic of theories of cognitive capitalism. In our work on logistics, more generally on contemporary capitalism, we definitely use many analyses that come from theories of cognitive capitalism. And in particular, we stress the relevance of cultural factors, even in the production of logistical spaces. I totally agree with you. The word space means much more than a portion of physical territory. So from this point of view, I completely agree with you. Should I read the...
I think now we can go for the third one. I'm sorry, Luis, that we made you wait.
Okay, I have to read it.
So thank you very much, and sorry for using the chat by mistake. At risk of boring you all with another evocation of the pandemic, I wonder, in the face of our depressing dependence, not only on the pharmaceutical market, but also on the private supply chains during the health crisis, if we could think of some kind of logistics for or by the common, related to an internationalistic politics of real democrational and emancipatory infrastructuring served by a new foundational economics.
Yes, thank you very much, Luis. You touch upon another crucial question. Actually, there are many attempts to tackle the question that you raise. The notion of counter logistics, for instance, is circulating quite a lot in critical debates. And it is not an abstract notion. There are practical experiments with counter-logistics. Maybe the most widespread and definitely interesting is the so-called platform cooperativism. In many parts of the world, there are cooperatives that in a way appropriate the very form and even the technology of the platform in order to use it for the deepening of solidarity. There is also in Bologna a project, and I have in a way contributed to that project. Of course, the point is that in order to work in an effective way, such projects, such cooperative projects must be economically sustainable. And this is not always easy, of course, because you have a kind of competition with corporate platforms. And I will put it in a very simple way. I mean, people have to pay more for a delivery coming from a cooperative than from Deliveroo or Glovo or Just Eat. Often it is just €1, you know, but they have to pay more. And this means that the success, the political success in terms of politics of real democratic and emancipatory infrastructure of such experiments depend on conditions that go well beyond cooperatives. You have to involve people. You have to involve restaurants and bars. You have to orchestrate a quite complex set of conditions in order to make platform cooperatives work. I repeat, in many parts of the world, including Bologna, there are interesting and promising experiments. Of course, the role of the municipality is often an important role, precisely for the orchestration, as I was saying, of the conditions that are requested for platform cooperatives to be successful. This is just an example, but counter logistics also refers to other attempts, you know, to other attempts. But I totally agree with the spirit, let's say, of your comment.
Anna, can I just because I have a follow up on this point made by Sandro. I want to ask because I was wondering about the relation between logistics and culture, and this goes a bit like, in a way, trying to widen a bit the perspective of extractivism, in a sense, looking not only at the process of extraction but also at the process of subjectivization and the production of culture, which is the intentional and mostly unintentional results of the logistical moment or paradigm, whatever we want to call it, which is, I think, something that you touch with Brett Nelson also in your book indirectly, when you talk about the fact that capitalism always have to produce its own outside. No, it doesn't just act on the outside, but produce and proliferate and multiplies the outside. So in this sense, my question was about, so there is something within the logistical paradigm that reshapes our culture. And it was something that Anna was touching when she was talking about synchronization and of course, kind of synchronizing our desires and expectation and ways of thinking and seeing and feeling to the rhythm and expectation of logistics. The fact that we tend to expect much more, and we take, and which was something you were saying now. Now, of course, if you do a cooperative platform, you are bound to provide a service which is gonna be less efficient, which doesn't mean it's gonna be less good, of course, but because there is something with the normativity implicit with logistics, which says that if something is not efficient in terms of time, effort, and cost reduction, then is unavoidably less valuable, no? So the question would be, very speculative in a way, would be, is there a possibility to actually disentangle logistics from this normativity, or actually in terms of critical thinking, there is also an effort to be done in order actually to challenge this implicit normativity of logistics and the way in which it reshapes, reproduces subjectivities, desire, expectation, and ways of seeing and perceiving, and of course then on acting on the world. Sorry, it's a bit like speculative, but
Andrea, se calhar lemos, maybe we can also read this new question from Gonçalo, and then Sandro,
Okay.
Sandro a bit more of time.
Okay.
So Gonçalo asks, hello, Bitcoin mining's immaterial logistics, is it a good metaphor for understanding commodity extraction, such as conflict minerals? Both processes seem to have similarities: storage, speculation, extraction, and they rely on a somehow shadow distribution platform. Even the blockchain is more focused on trust than the transparency of the financial flows. As a criticism, what can be done to bring clarity and transparency to the upstream logistics, extraction, and commodity distribution, such as conflict minerals from Nigeria, knowing who is mining, where are they are shipped to, and what financial products are using them? Thank you. Very interesting discussion. Eu gostava de lembrar a todos que não precisam de escrever, também podem levantar a mão e liga-se a voz. Pronto, se alguém quiser falar e não escrever. Obrigada.
Is that another question?
This Gonçalo, we only have this one, and I was telling everybody if that people can raise hands.
Okay.
I was just making this point.
Well, Andrea's question is far from speculative, although it also has speculative implications. Depending on how we define culture, our culture is compenetrated, shaped, crisscrossed by logistics. And I think you made an important point speaking of the normativity of logistics. We have to further analyze the normativity of logistics. I was speaking before of space and time. And what I was calling the logistical utopia corresponds to a normativity. It is true that logistical spaces are not smooth, but the normativity of logistics is strictly associated with the idea of smooth space. which means that if spaces are not smooth, they must become smooth. And the same is true regarding temporality, this idea of synchronization within the framework of a 24/7 working of the logistical machine. Again, this is in a way a utopia, but as a logistical norm, it turns into a dystopia for a multitude of people. You know, just think of labor. For now, in very general terms, I mean, if labor is organized and experienced under the permanent pressure of the norm 24/7. You know, there is a nice book, 24/7, The End of Sleep, as a kind of logistical utopia. But living without sleeping is a kind of nightmare, it's not a dream. You know? So there is a logistical normativity that exercises a powerful pressure on life and culture. Our life is traversed and shaped by the logistical rationality and the logistical normativity. This is a kind of new world, and we have to learn to inhabit this new world. We have to forge tools for resistance. We have to imagine within this new world a politics of liberation. This is at least my point, you know. And I think that in this sense, the relation between culture and logistics is at least double, because on the one hand, you have the pressure of the logistical normativity on culture, but on the other hand, you have also the possibility of a cultural production that contributes to the task of inventing new ways of inhabiting a world shaped by logistics. I must say that in recent years, there are also many artists who started to work with logistics. And I hope that in the future, cultural production on logistics will be more and more important, because we need a new imaginary. We need to better understand, you know, the way in which logistics transforms our everyday experience, our body, our nerves, our senses, the way in which we see, the way in which we hear, you know. And if you think I am a bit exaggerating, just think of the relation that most of us have with the smartphone. The smartphone is a logistical device. It is a logistical device. It plays a crucial role in the implementation of the logistical normativity. And at least in my case, I have it in my hands the whole day, you know. And this produces transformations even at the physical level.
Yes, I was thinking, before we jump in the next question, I was thinking, for instance, of a conference I've seen. It's a text by Fred Moten and Stefano Harni, but I've seen it live by Stefano Harni in Athens during the refugee crisis. So it was kind of had a huge impact, and it was very interesting because they were talking about logistics and the slave trade, but in the end they were heading to the notion of access and the notion to this. Well, we were in the midst of the Greek crisis, and everybody was doing Airbnb of their own houses. People were using their private cars as Uber. All this was starting, so everything seemed to be as I mean, it seems that almost everybody would give access to almost everything as a way of having money. But it was very interesting the way they framed it. Well, I think the notion of access was very sharp to think this, how contemporary capitalism was reshaping at that time. And I think maybe now with this pandemic crisis, things are going a bit different because of all these distance measures. But I think the notion of access, and when you think of the means of production, where are the means of production, who can work and how, it's a useful notion, I think. But maybe this for tomorrow and for Platform Capital. So maybe now we'll answer the last question, which is already here. So on Bitcoin.
It's again a great question, a great comment, first of all, and a very intriguing question. My answer is yes. Bitcoin mining in material logistics is a good metaphor for understanding not only commodity extraction, which means literal extraction, but also extractive operations that, as in the case of logistics, impinge on something immaterial, which means social cooperation. Tomorrow we will speak of data and of data extraction, which is the most important moment in the operations of digital platforms. And I think that Bitcoin mining in material logistics is a good metaphor also to understand the operations of the extractive operations of digital platforms. In the case of Bitcoin, there is an immaterial logistics, but there is also a very material logistics. A material logistics that has to do with the geography of data centers. Because without giant data centers, Bitcoin mining cannot work. And you may know that the geography of data centers is a very peculiar geography, because it is dependent on several factors. First of all, the temperature that must be very low in order to allow the working of data centers. So this is another kind of geography that we can inscribe onto the map, complicated it even more. You remember that before I was speaking of logistical spaces, geopolitical spaces. Well, there are other spaces, although in very general sense, in very general terms, we can say that the geography of data centers is part and parcel of the geography of logistics. And the question of clarity and transparency is is an important and difficult question. You mentioned conflict minerals, and there have been important transnational campaigns on the issue. In the case of logistics, and in particular in the case of digital platforms, the situation may be a bit more tricky and complicated. Again, the main question is the question of data. You know, the use of data and the possibility to claim transparency regarding the use of data. The use of data by platforms is by definition a very obscure use. Very obscure use. And in order to claim transparency, we must first of all be aware of the fact that the way in which digital platforms, just think of Facebook, work, is not accountable. Is not accountable. Which does not mean that it is not possible to make platforms accountable. But think of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where it is clear that by the very nature of these big, huge aggregations of data, it is difficult to impose transparency, but I think it is a crucial battle to be fought in the field of platforms and more generally in the field of logistics.
Thank you. Maybe one or two more questions and then we finish.
Okay.
Andrea, anyone?
Don't know. Just maybe just a quick one, which is not very quick as a possible answer, but but I was wondering, talking about logistics and its relation with neoliberalism, which means a way to read the not just the difference, but the way in which logistics has become so central in the way you were showing, you were arguing, because of course you put a certain genealogy of logistics in which there is colonialism, slave trade, and war strategy, in which there is something in common, and there are contexts which are very authoritarian, very oppressive, and based on order and relation of domination. On the other end, when logistics start to begin as a central element in the development of liberalism, and of course all the discussion of Foucault, it's to some extent tied. Of course, he never used the term logistics, but he used a lot the term circulation, which has a very important role in his discussion. But of course, there is something very peculiar in the shift from liberalism to neoliberalism. And now, of course, I'm simplifying because, of course, there are thousands of different interpretation and definitions and blah, blah, blah. But what I'm interested in is in a very simple way. In a way, we can say that with respect to liberalism, logistics is still, even if not necessarily term logistics, but if we assume the sense of logistics as a kind of organization, and in the definition you were using at the beginning, for the right amount at the right time and the right position, etc., etc., is still an instrumental element, because there is still an assumption that there is a kind of invisible end which will let things flow in a way or another. So, of course, in a very simplistic way. But then with neoliberalism, and especially with the argument that Foucault does following the Lippmann colloquium, the idea that the advent of neoliberalism is fundamentally about a project of reorganizing the world in order for the market, readapt the world to the market, no? In a way. And in this sense, we can say that in this setting, logistics become really central because it's a matter of constantly reorganizing all the relations in order to make them fitting, synchronized to, of course, the functioning of the capital, etc. So I was wondering what you think about this relation, logistics and neoliberalism, as opposed to simply logistics and capitalism.
Is this the last one?
I would say so. Maybe yes. Anyone has more questions? We will have tomorrow, so we can think of tomorrow. And maybe one final comment on Franco and Andrea are organizing this book, which has no name yet, but will be soon. Actually, will be published by a cooperative, Cooperative Outro Modo and Le Monde Diplomatique. In 1 month, 1 month and a half will be out there. The first book on logistics in Portugal, with a postfacio by Sandra. And I think I think it's last question, and then we see each other tomorrow. We will put today the link for tomorrow's lesson online.
Yeah, just about the book, very, very quickly. It's, I mean, still have no title, not official title, and is a book that gather different set of contributions, original and translations, and it's basically organized in 2 main parts. One which is more theoretical, and it tries to reflect on logistics from the point of view of the problematics of logistics as well as the aesthetics. So questions of which I was touching in actually my first question. And then there is another section which is called Sites, and which deals with logistics, with various sites of logistics in Portugal and in the ex-empire territories. And so it tries to develop this relation between the theoretical and the empirical section, with a specific focus on Portugal and the ex-colonies, which we think is a kind of interesting way to deal with this movement of critical logistic thinking, but also focusing at the same time in Portugal, which is interestingly central historically and also recently. Yeah, I don't know if Franco wants to add anything else, but you know.
Yes, may I add something about the book, but may I switch to Portuguese? And I'm sure that Professor Mazada understands Portuguese. Sim, então o livro ainda não tem um título definitivo. O título que inicialmente tínhamos pensado agora está a ser repensado. Na primeira parte do livro, portanto, encontra-se muito dos temas que também foram debatidos hoje e outros, como a relação entre logística e género, ou uma necessidade de periodização da logística, que também o Sandro mencionou várias vezes hoje, por exemplo, a partir das várias genealogias da logística. A segunda parte, eu acho que é, na verdade, um contributo mais criativo que tentamos dar à introdução dessas temáticas no debate aqui em Portugal, porque é, digamos assim, articulado à volta de 3 ideias base. Não é? A primeira é ver como a logística apresenta-se como esse sistema global que tem essa pretensa de ser mútuo, mas na sua tradição concreta, local, situada, é sempre um processo de choque pervasivo, muitas vezes violento. Portanto, a sua tradição territorial é sempre diferente. Portanto, Portugal e também o antigo Império Português representam o laboratório onde nós tentamos olhar a estas frições, recuperando também uma noção que o Sandro já introduziu, que é também da ANTSIM. Depois, a segunda ideia é, digamos assim, ver como Portugal se coloca dentro desse que podemos imaginar como imperativo da circulação sustentado pela logística, ou seja, qual é a função na divisão internacional da circulação e da logística de Portugal. Aí poderão encontrar-se, por exemplo, porque o Uber escolheu Portugal como laboratório e como centro para experimentar novos produtos e novas tecnologias que depois são difundidas na Europa, ou também como Portugal se coloca no setor da defesa e segurança europeia pelo patrulhamento das fronteiras do Mediterrâneo através de uma tecnologia produzida em Portugal em cooperação com outros países e com outras empresas transnacionais de drones, com os drones. E depois, digamos assim, como a logística muda os espaços concretos. E aí será interessante olhar, por exemplo, a relação que há entre a financiarização e a habitação no caso de Lisboa. E também nos sítios tentar problematizar mais a cronologia da logística, a sua relação com o colonialismo, tentando estudar, tentando utilizar categorias que emergem do terreno privilegiado do presente, da análise do capitalismo contemporâneo e então da logística, questionar os impérios coloniais. E, portanto, aí estarão contributos, por exemplo, acerca da eletrificação da África portuguesa ou da exportação do café, para mencionar alguns. Portanto, a ideia que moveu essa parte de sítios são basicamente essas três. E quando o livro sairá, teremos todo o prazer em apresentá-lo também noutras.
Sim, estava a pensar nisso exatamente. Bom, Sandro, perhaps you can answer the last question and then we go.
I also look forward to the book. Sounds really interesting. I like Andrea's quick question. It refers to a big problem, though. Let me put it so. I emphasized in a class the 1960s and the early 1970s. And I was trying to show how logistics provided capital with new and powerful tools to react to the big crisis of the early 1970s. And in general, the reaction to the crisis of the early 1970s inaugurated what is often called the neoliberal hegemony. So from this point of view, it is clear that there is a link between logistics in its current shape and neoliberalism. Just think, for instance, of the way in which the shipping container disrupted the organization of labor in ports and docks, attacking in a very violent way working class power, very concrete forms of working class power. And that was, you know, the main aim of neoliberalism in the same years. For me, logistics is an angle on the materiality of neoliberalism. You know, in the critical discussion of neoliberalism, too often neoliberalism is reduced to a set of doctrines, of theories. Bringing logistics in opens up a different critical angle on neoliberalism. then I think it would be necessary to specify a bit what we mean by neoliberalism. You know, in the last years, neoliberalism has often become also kind of catch-all concept. I think that one of the most interesting books that came out recently on neoliberalism is the book by Queen Slobodian entitled Globalists. It's a very interesting book because it shows that at the origin of neoliberalism, particularly in Austria and in Germany, there was the end of empire. The need to reorganize the global economy after the end of empire. From this point of view, logistics played a very important role. At the same time, I can also add that logistics shows that the autonomy of the market is just an ideological kind of construct. Logistics shows, first of all, at the level of the world economy, what is requested, the amount, let's say, of labor that is needed in order to make the world economy work. So I would say that logistics in its current shape since the so-called revolution in logistics is an instance of neoliberal rationality, but it also allows to problematize a bit the very understanding of neoliberal rationality. There would be much more to say. Tomorrow I will use some Foucauldian notions in order to make sense of, let's say, the governmental effects of the operations of platforms. And it will be another kind of perspective on neoliberalism and logistics.
Okay, I think we already, it's late, so we continue tomorrow.
We will continue tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much, Andrea and Franco. Thank you so much,
Anna.
all of you. And let's meet tomorrow at the same time in the same place, I think.
Same place.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Ciao,
ciao,
see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Vediamo domani, ciao.
A domani.
Ciao.
Ciao.